All right, I don't know where to begin now that I have to say something. Evidently, I'm from Puerto Rico originally, that's why I know Spanish. I moved to the United States when I was 11 years old. And I had no contact with art really until I met two young men when I was in junior high school who were involved with graffiti. And so through seeing their drawings, I very quickly got hooked. I said, you got to teach me how to do this. And so they started teaching me the process of drawing in the graffiti style. And eventually one of them introduced me to the works of Raphael and then Michelangelo. And then a whole world started to open up to me that I wanted to become part of. And so eventually in high school it became clear that I wanted to go to art school. And it wasn't until I was in my last year of undergrad, if I'm remembering it correctly, that I became Orthodox. Actually, I discovered Orthodoxy, and then in my first year of my graduate program at Hunter College for painting, then I became Orthodox. I was received into the church. And at the same time, there was a struggle about, all right, what do I want to do with my life? Do I want to become monastic? Do I get married? And what about painting career? And so one thing leads to another, and I end up in the monastery, and that's where I picked up icon painting. I basically transferred all the knowledge that I had acquired through my painting education to iconography. And so it became a process basically of discovering what we have been discussing today. The fact that icon painting at first appears to be very straightforward and simple because all you have to do is copy something else, but ultimately you realize, well, that's really not what it's about. One of my first icons, and not my first icon, was an exact replica of a Palek icon. Palek was a village in Russia that specialized in the production of icons. And I basically did everything according to the rules and according to the canons, right? But you could very easily see that it was dead. It didn't have anything that I put in there. It wasn't an experience of the prototype within myself that then I expressed in conformity with tradition. So what I'm going to do today, it's going to be a little bit more of a rigid approach, and then I'm going to go about it, and I'm gonna read the talk, but meanwhile I'm gonna have more text for you to look at to help you grasp some of the concepts than images. And I'm glad that Philip provided you with so many images, because it gives you a really good background for you to then relate what I will be discussing and put into context. So I'm going to start with two. By the way, you could easily see here that the talk is called Imagination, Expression, and Icon, Reclaiming the Internal Prototype. And I'm going to start with a couple of quotations. One by Fotis Kontoglou. For those who don't know who he is, he's a Greek master of iconography from the late 19th, early 20th century. He went to Paris. He had a career as an illustrator. He was a great novelist and writer. Throughout his career, he was highly acclaimed in Greece, but he's one, along with Ouspensky and Krug, Philip mentioned them, who collaborated, these three people and others, in reviving the icon in the 20th century. So his work, along with Ouspensky's Meaning of Icons, which book you'll find on the table, are very important for us in the 21st century, and they were instrumental in the 20th century to really help us understand what it is that we have to do in order to retap to the tradition, what it means to paint a traditional icon. And so, Fotis Cantiglu wrote the text called the Orthodox Tradition, or actually the text is called the Orthodox Tradition of Iconography, put together by Kavarnos. It's an edition that gathers some of the the written work of Cantiglu. And in there, he states, each one of us has his own peculiar way of expression. The capable artist is by no means a mechanical copier, but a creator in the true sense of the term. Unfortunately, even among iconographers, there are some who have the idea that iconography is an art of copying. Such artists, by saying this, reveal quite clearly that they have understood nothing with regard to this art, and that they are incapable of probing its mystical depth, but occupy themselves only with the surface. Okay. That sets up the problem.
Father Silouan, one word, forgive my interruption.
Sure.
The first church that Fotis Cantiglu planted in North America is the Holy Trinity Greek Orthodox Church in Charleston, South Carolina. Wow. So if you all didn't know that, or if you're in town only for the weekend, you should also be sure to go to Holy Trinity where you can see his first works in North America.
Thank you very much, Father, because I had no clue. That's awesome. That's great. The next quotation I'm going to give you is by St. John of Kronstadt. I'm not working here. Maybe it'll work. It's probably lagging in.
Sometimes it depends on the position because you're still, yes. No?
Does it have to be on top of a little board?
Perhaps. No?
Oh yes, it looks like it's showing something. Click it once to the left. Yes?
There we go. Great. Okay. Icons are a requirement of our nature. Can our nature do without an image? Can we recall to mind an absent person without representing or imagining him to ourselves? Has not God Himself given us the capacity of representation and imagination? Icons are the Church's answer to a crying necessity of our nature. The point being made here by St. John of Kronstadt is of crucial importance if we want to avoid some misconceptions surrounding the icon. We often hear that the icon has nothing to do with the imagination, which is generally taken to be the untrustworthy playground of demons. The negative diagnosis is a commonplace in ascetic writings on pure prayer, as can be found in the classic text on Orthodox hesychastic spirituality, the Philokalia. However, St. John in this passage appears to run counter to the norm. While on the one hand the ascetic tradition speaks of the imagination as detrimental and deceptive, on the other hand, St. John sees it as a gift from God. So is there a contradiction here? Not at all. St. John does not contradict the ascetic tradition surrounding the ambiguities of the imagination, but rather augments and complements it, thereby helping us arrive at a more nuanced understanding. He is definitely not to be interpreted as encouraging the cultivation of imaginative fantasies as a method of prayer, something that often leads to delusion. Rather, he gives us the other side of the coin. Instead of focusing on the dangers surrounding the misuse of the imagination, he points out its indispensable, edifying, and profitable side, its undeniable link to the icon. The two are inseparable. The one presupposes the other, since the imaginative faculty involves nothing other than mental images, mental icons, if you will. Hence, to deprecate one is to deprecate the other. He finds in the imagination a defense for the icon. But St. John is not alone. He in fact follows very closely St. Theodore the Studite, who says, quote, "Imagination is one of the powers of the soul. It is itself a kind of image, as both are depictions. The image, therefore, that resembles the imagination cannot be useless. If imagination were useless, it would be an utterly futile part of human nature. But then the other powers of the soul would also be useless: the senses, memory, intellect, and reason. Thus, a reasoned and sober consideration of human nature shows how nonsensical it is to despise the image and the imagination." So what I want to emphasize and focus on from the outset is not the complexity surrounding the methods of prayer, but rather the fact that we should be cautious not to cart away the imagination as something completely useless and evil, based on our misunderstanding and misapplication of hesychastic writings. Indeed, we are not to cultivate fantasies during prayer. However, as St. John and St. Theodore imply, and as we will see in other fathers, as a God-given faculty, the imagination has a positive dimension. It can be used properly and play a profitable role in other areas, in particular craftsmanship. We can then say that the imagination, as a receptacle of images and sensations, is a neutral faculty of the soul, bordering between the senses and the higher faculty, the nous. It serves a mediating function which makes it ambiguous, as if having two faces or sides. It can look up towards the intelligible light of divine truth and become luminous, or it can look down towards the enticement of the senses in hedonism and become darkened. In its receptivity to impressions, it resembles soft and pliable wax. It can also be compared to a mirror. So what is it reflecting? How is it being impressed, inscribed, and directed? It can be steered by the purified nous, inspired by the Holy Spirit, or by the passions, manipulated by demons. In short, it can lead us to delusion or aid us in our ascent towards deification, theosis, our participation in the divine nature, as St. Peter puts it in his epistle. So today I want to approach things from a slightly different angle. Yes, the icon is unquestionably an affirmation of the incarnation, sacramental object. It can be described as a support of contemplation or prayer, a vehicle of teaching, a window into heaven, theology in color, etc. Yes, this is all true and good and not to be undermined. But I have specifically chosen these two statements by St. John and Cantiglu since they remind us of what tends to go unnoticed, bypassed, or ignored when discussing the icon, its creative act, which inevitably involves expression and imagination. This, I'm sure, sounds dangerous to those of us who have been repeatedly told that the icon is not to be confused with art, which amounts to saying that it has nothing to do with vain and solipsistic self-expression or dubious imaginative inventions, the latter being disparaged as nothing more than reckless and irrational fantasy, perhaps in the mind of some best exemplified by the Gothic nightmares of Hieronymus Bosch. But then again, some might recall with apprehension the elevation of the imagination above reason in Romanticism. Others of its connection to the lugubrious subconscious in Surrealism. And still others will blame it for all the aberrations we see today in contemporary art. But, needless to say, this is not the imaginative context we have in mind. Rather, when we speak of the imaginative act, we mean the mental imaging process that precedes any making or manufacturing. Well, I got the wrong one. This is what you want to see. We articulate within ourselves an idea or form as a mental image before we express it, create the work, or bring it to actuality. Using Aristotle's four causes terminology, we can then call this idea the formal cause in contrast to the final cause, that is, the end or purpose towards which the work is directed. The craftsman himself and his tools through which the work is realized being the efficient cause. The raw material to be shaped by the imagined idea, the material cause. Therefore, in this process of craftsmanship, the imagination plays a crucial and inevitable role. Hence, the need for us to understand its valuable and positive connection to iconography. But it should be stressed that what the iconographer imagines or recalls to mind as St. John puts it, are not his own illusory inventions, but rather revealed truth, real deified persons and sacred events, as noetically known within ecclesial life. In other words, the content of his formal cause is not his own, but the resplendence of Orthodox doctrine and tradition. The imagination is to reflect these as an polished bronze mirror. However, no two mirrors are the same. Inevitably, the reflection of each, depending on polish and nuances of surface quality, will have peculiar characteristics. Hence, from this positive use of the imagination just described arises what Cantiglu calls a peculiar way of expression, an indispensable feature of the authentic icon. I believe that looking at this often undermined side of the creative act can help us avoid the approach that makes of iconography mere slavish repetition, the superficial and mechanical copying of old works and nothing more. This tendency is often accompanied by a simplistic notion of what it means to adhere to tradition and fear of artistic license. Cantiglu's statement about the superficial approach to iconography is a problem that will always be a challenge to face in the practice of any traditional sacred art. How then are we to overcome this tendency? Okay, the alternative that I would like to propose today is an approach to icon painting that reclaims the positive use of the imagination, in which the prototype is engaged not merely as an external sketch, but also as a mental image to contemplate with the eye of the heart and interpret as it is being painted. The highest ideal in the application of this process is to be seen in the iconographer who does not rely on external sketches at all, but works directly from his heart. It seems clear to me that the diversity of styles in the history of icon painting, as Philip was showing, attests to this fact, this act of reimagining, in which personal and cultural temperaments are not stifled, but rather flourish in freedom, as they express the ecclesial experience in unique ways, yet in full harmony and conformity with tradition. Okay, before we explore the creative act in order to supply a context to what will follow, I think it would be important to clarify what we mean by terms such as nous, art, and tradition. We can approach the term nous by way of the icon's distinctive aesthetic. Without a doubt, the icon, through its unique pictorial language, unveils an inner vision. It represents a way of seeing not merely according to the senses, but rather with the eye of the heart, what the fathers called the nous, in Latin intellectus. and not to get confused with what we think of as intellect nowadays, intellectual work. It's perhaps better to think of it as the spiritual intellect rather than just pure ratiocination. Although the nous is higher than discursive reason, dianoia in Greek, the fathers at times group these together when designating man as logikos, or rational. The nous, as we read in the Philokalia, is to be understood as, quote, the highest faculty of man, through which, provided it is purified, he knows God or the inner principles of created things by means of direct apprehension or spiritual perception. This direct apprehension or intuition is seen in the Spirit according to the Holy Spirit, above abstract concepts, subjectivism, passions, and fantasy. It encompasses a wide spectrum, from the loftiest forms of prophetic vision to the more immediate knowledge of God through the beauty of creation. The pictorial principles of iconography, its traditional formal language, often called the canon, arise from this inner vision, which from here on we will refer to as noetic intuition. As we have noted, it is often said that the icon is not to be confused with art. A statement that needs clarification since, ironically, although used to defend its cause, it ends up belittling its creative import and demands. On the one hand, we would have to say that this statement is only partly true if we mean by this that the icon is not gallery art. That is, the icon is not an autonomous art object, art for art's sake, an end in itself, an individualistic statement. But on the other hand, it is a very specific kind of art, like Philip was pointing out. That is liturgical art, and as such, a major component in the total work of art of church cult, or worship, ritual. The divine liturgy, in which various arts participate to create a harmoniously integrated whole, contributing towards the deification of man. Moreover, the icon is obviously an art in the traditional sense of the word techne. In Latin, ars, from which we derive the word art, meaning craftsmanship, the skillful joining together of parts according to a right course of reason, or logos, as Aristotle puts it in the Nicomachean Ethics. Hence, art is to be understood as the principle of manufacture, applied to a specific purpose or end, and remains in the artist as a knowledge. According to this understanding, there is no stark difference between so-called fine art and crafts, beauty and function, or meaning and utility, as we have it today. As Elder Emilianos tells us, quote, for the ancients and for Scripture, no distinction was made between art and artifacts, or technology, which, if they corresponded to the needs of our nature, could hardly be foreign or hostile to beauty. In a traditional integrated society such as the Middle Ages, under the category of art fell anything from painting, sculpture, calligraphy, masonry, architecture, farming, to music, poetry, rhetoric, philosophy, teaching, ruling, etc. So it is important to realize that this traditional doctrine of art, which is still to be found in the Orthodox Church, although we might not realize it, has been the norm from time immemorial, our modern conception of fine art being the anomaly in the history of civilization. It could be said that liturgical art is, in fact, the highest realization of the function of art. That is, the act of joining together, since it serves to reconnect us to God Himself. Hence, it is the culmination of art's incarnational import, its capacity to unite heaven and earth. we can then begin to see how within this context, iconography is not to be seen as requiring less creative engagement than our contemporary notions of fine art demands, as some might think. Rather, in being more complete and having a higher purpose, it indeed demands the most out of us, requiring the mastery of pictorial principles, manufacturing skill, intellectual rigor, theological knowledge, the coming together of creativity and spiritual discipline, functional and symbolic values. All of this unfolds in accordance to tradition. And here's where it gets pretty interesting. But what do we mean by tradition? All right? We all seem to have an innate understanding of what that means. And I'm sure we have a noetic knowledge of what it is, although it would be hard to put into words, so we'll give it a try. So, by tradition we do not mean the legalistic use of ossified canonical forms, mere conventional conservatism, nor antiquarianism. We rather mean the ever new and ever renewing life of the Holy Spirit in the Church, through which we come to the knowledge of the mystery of the Word incarnate. Or, as described by the English painter Cecil Collins, it is, quote, that continuum of knowledge which deals with the meaning and purpose of man's life and with the possibility of his rebirth. It is a knowledge ever new, fresh, immortal, always present, not subject to time. In short, it is nothing other than the revelation, with a big R, the pre-eternal counsel that has been made manifest and still continues with us today in its deifying efficacy. Yes, tradition is immutable and living, expressed in a multiplicity of forms, whether it be words, images, architectural arrangements, sounds, gestures, rites, etc. All of which do not exhaust the unfathomable depths of tradition. These remain unalterable insofar as they continue to function as adequate conveyors or symbols of truth. The Church then has the liberty, through the power of the Holy Spirit, to alter these according to pastoral necessity. The forms arise but do not stand above tradition. For as Losky puts it, tradition is, quote, the unique mode of receiving the truth. We say specifically unique mode and not uniform mode, for tradition in its pure notion, there belongs nothing formal. It does not impose on human consciousness formal guarantees of the truth of faith, but gives access to the discovery of their inner evidence. But this, of course, is not an excuse to dismiss and dismantle all formal expressions of tradition arbitrarily, as if we have to update things according to external criteria on based on revisionist historicism, progressivist or modernist notions. Far from it. On the contrary, it is a caution against the kind of formalism that tends to mistake the surface for the content, the letter for the spirit of tradition. Both extremes, whether it be willful innovation, syncretism, or hardening formalism, are to be avoided. Be that as it may, when it comes to the icon, there is no doubt that in the course of history, tradition has been expressed in a variety of styles reflecting personal and cultural temperaments, as iconographers have creatively confronted and resolved immediate needs. These also reflect different levels of spiritual maturity, noetic intuition, and artistic mastery. Hence, tradition cannot be trapped into just one approach or mode of expression, no style or school of iconography can claim monopoly to the most authentic formula, although it might be firmly grounded on what can be called the timeless pictorial principles of iconography. It should be kept in mind that these principles are not purely static, but rather extremely flexible and expandable. They are not the tradition itself, but that which makes up its glorious garment, the efficient grammar and letters of a language, giving clear expression and manifesting the unfathomable depths of tradition. And like all languages, they go through organic changes. The pictorial principles derive their timelessness and accuracy insofar as they participate in immutable tradition. From this participation, they become the unifying components in a diversity of pictorial dialects or styles. The styles can perhaps be called the unique rather than the uniform modes of embodying and expressing the noetic intuition of truth imparted by tradition. In short, there is room for dynamic creativity in cooperation with the Holy Spirit. Obedience to tradition does not stifle or deaden, but rather paradoxically transforms, revitalizes, purifies, and resurrects persons and cultures to the fullness of their unique capabilities. With this understanding of tradition in place, we can now return to the question of the imagination and unique modes of expression. Let us start with a passage by St. Gregory Palamas, who says that, quote, "This imaginative faculty of the soul is an intermediary between the intellect," which the translation is, they use the word intellect for nous, "the intellect and the senses. For the intellect beholds and dwells upon the images received in itself from the senses, and it formulates various kinds of thought by means of distinctions, analysis, and inference. This happens in various ways, impassionately or dispassionately, or in a state of between the two, both with and without error. From these thoughts are born most virtues and vices, as well as opinions, whether right or wrong. When the intellect enthrones itself on the soul's imaginative faculty, and thereby becomes associated with the senses, it engenders a composite form of knowledge." He then adds that the various kinds of knowledge we attain in this way pertains not only to natural science, but to every method and art, that is, technique, or craftsmanship, as defined previously. By the way, the passage is from the 4th volume of the Philokalia, which I recommend you take a look at. In St. Gregory Palamas, his chapters on natural science and theology. Now, so as we can see, as stated in the beginning and confirmed by St. Gregory, the imagination is a neutral faculty, instrumental in the acquisition of knowledge, and serves an indispensable demiurgic function in craftsmanship. Through it we shape, synthesize, clarify, conceptualize mental images, thereby embodying our ideas before they are given external expression, whether in the form of buildings, sculptures, vessels, vestments, icons, etc. While we are on this earth clothed in garments of skins, or suffering from the consequences of the fall, suffering from mortality, having to supply for our physical and spiritual needs by means of manufacture and symbolic articulations, the imagination will always serve this indispensable function. In this process, as St. Gregory notes, the intellect, or nous, the soul's governing faculty, is to enthrone itself on the imagination, thereby stabilizing and directing its use as a tool according to the right course of reason, as we referred to earlier when speaking about technique. As Elder Sophrony explains, echoing St. Gregory, quote, "We see a third aspect of the power of the imagination, when a man uses his faculties of memory and imagination to think out the solution to some technical problem. And when he has done so, his mind will seek means for the practical realization of his idea. This activity of the reason, in association with the imagination, plays a vital part in human culture and is essential for the economy of life. We can also perhaps think of the imagination as a tablet or parchment onto which the nous sketches, alters, erases, and redraws mental images according to his spiritual illumination, ideas, and knowledge of principles. Hence, the craftsman's process of mental imaging can be said to correspond analogically to the act of creation by the Logos. By the way, these are different, basically variations of on a theme that betrays the fact that tradition doesn't mean the ossification of forms. That we might want to look at for a moment until I get to the next one. So, as I was saying, the craftsman's process of mental imaging can be said to correspond analogically to the act of creation by the Logos, meaning the Son of God, the Word of God, second person of the Trinity. Just as man has a form or idea in his mind before he imprints it on formless matter, so likewise there are recent principles, logi, words, invisible models, or imageless images, in the Logos of God before these are expressed, that is, manifested, given concrete hypostatic existence in creation from formless earth, as we read in Genesis. Therefore, some have even called the Logos the divine reason through whom all things were made, the art of the Father. Man, created in the image of God, in his creative act, imitates the divine craftsman. St. John of Damascus points to this traditional analogy when comparing the invisible models, or paradigmata in Greek, archetypes or prototypes of God, to the plans and prescriptions an architect has in mind before he sets out to build. And Andrew probably knows this better than anybody else. He says, there are also in God images and models of his acts yet to come, those things which are his for all eternity, which is always changeless. Blessed Dionysius, who has great knowledge of divine things, says that these images and models were marked on beforehand, for in his will God has prepared all things that are yet to happen, making them unalterable before they come to pass. And this is the important part here to emphasize. Just as a man who wishes to build a house would first write out the plan according to its prescriptions. Implicit in this statement is the fact that the architect does not write the plan before he has first beheld a mental image, paradigma, of it in his imagination. This is also taken for granted by St. Nicholas Cavasilas, who speaks of the craftsman gazing noetically within his soul at the exemplars, models, or mental images he is to follow in executing his work. He says, it is the practice of painters to depict according to an exemplar, in that they produce their art from preliminary sketches, even when they use their memory to such things and look to the soul for a model. Nor does this apply to painters only, but one may see it in the case of sculptors, architects, and indeed all craftsmen. Were it possible to see that artificer's soul with the eye, one would see the original house or statue or other work apart from the material. We should notice that St. Nicholas speaks of exemplars and models as both external and internal to the craftsman. The first is designated by the sketch, the second by the mental image recollected by memory. A recollection which, of course, as St. John of Kronstadt shows, unfolds imaginatively. St. Theodore de Studat also echoes St. Nicholas when he says in reference to the icon, quote, "We are taught to draw not only what comes into our perception by touch and sight, but also what is comprehended by mental contemplation." I believe that the best example of an iconographer's freedom in solely relying on the contemplation or imaginative recollection of the internal prototype is to be found in the renowned account written by Epiphany the Wise in 1415 of Theophanes the Greek at work. I think that's, there it goes. He says about Theophanes the Greek, "While he delineated and painted all these things, no one ever saw him looking at models as some of our painters do, who, being filled with doubt, constantly bend over them, casting their eyes hither and thither, and instead of painting with colors, they gaze at the models as often as they need to. He, however, seemed to be painting with his hands, while his feet moved without rest. His tongue conversed with visitors. His mind dwelled on something lofty and wise, and his rational eyes contemplated that beauty which is rational." This, of course, is the highest ideal, and not all will attain to it. Nevertheless, it is one worth keeping in mind and aspiring towards by the contemporary iconographer. So the question remains, is the external or internal prototype determining our icons? Undoubtedly both. It couldn't be otherwise for most of us, but perhaps without much awareness of the imaginative act or mental contemplation. It seems to me that the general tendency is to think of icon painting mainly in terms of the external sketch, and we have virtually forgotten the inner model, the imagined prototype. As Cantiglu says, we tend to occupy ourselves only with the surface. We tend to undermine what was taken for granted by the traditional craftsman, the positive, crucial, and unavoidable role of the imagination in the creative act. Therefore, we fail to consciously direct it and accrue the efficacious results in iconography. But here, I believe, is where we find freedom from the mechanical copying Cantiglu warns us about. The process of reimagining the prototype is free, insofar as it is not servile to mechanically reproducing the surface of the external sketch, but intuitively apprehends its spiritual content, interprets and represents it in a new and living way. The interpretation will inevitably vary from painter to painter, since each individual's mental image of a given prototype will always be slightly different when solving specific pictorial problems. This is unavoidable, for as we are all unique, for we are all unique individuals, living within unique cultures and a specific historical moment. The painter can even revalorize pictorial elements from his immediate or foreign cultures when these are found useful and adequate in conveying the content of tradition. The icon will inevitably reflect, yet need not be overwhelmed by the nuances arising from these contingent factors. Undoubtedly, the essential and unalterable elements of the given subject are to remain, but the subtleties of color, line, composition, etc. will vary from person to person and place to place. If in conformity to tradition, they will be at once time-specific and timeless, showing both individual temperament and spiritual objectivity. All right, the reason why I'm showing you this is because the account about Theophan the Greek appears to be so far removed from anything possible that somehow, you know, you can't point at a specific person and say, oh, he could do that, you know. But one of the painters that I could think of that does have that capacity is George Cordes. He painted the church Holy Trinity in Colombia, and he's done many churches in the United States. And his process of work is just what you're seeing. He's not looking at a sketch. He has made the prototypes his own, and he has memorized them. And so he goes to the space, and the space basically, in a way, determines what he's going to be doing, because given the specific strictures of what you're working with, then it points you to the right direction in terms of scale, proportions, so on and so forth. And so that's him at work. And this is one of his sketches. As you see, you know, there's erasures that go on, and so it's pretty fluid. Okay. And these are, that's one of his recent icons of St. Paul's vision, road to Damascus. A very peculiar icon, but very powerful. And that's one, a dormition that he did. And the reason why I'm showing you this two in particular will become more explicit as I show you the other ones. That sets the beginning for a variation of the theme of the dormition in other icons. And see these Russian icons. This is from Kora in Constantinople, Mosaic. Different, you know, additions, more or less details depending on what needs to be expressed, what iconographer wanted to say at that moment about the reality of the event. And here are two other ones, and I picked that one at the end is because it's very abstract, you know, and so when you go back to Cordes' work, then it doesn't seem so strange. It does have abstract quality, but nevertheless, it's in full conformity to tradition. Sometimes we get so used to seeing a specific kind of image that we forget that in medieval times, iconographers were doing very abstract things and very, what we would consider to be mannered kind of work, very cartoonish and sometimes garish, but they were doing it, and it's traditional work. And so we get into aesthetic habits, so to speak. Now, for some, there remains a fear of artistic license, I'm sure. But not to worry, we're not advancing in cautious and unrestrained subjectivism, a blurring of the edges between iconography and gallery art. Ironically, the 20th century revival of the icon has instilled in some of us the notion that tradition is the ossification of artistic forms, rather than reawakening an awareness of its living, ever-renewing power. Safeguarding the canon has led to a morbid fear of innovation, making it difficult to access tradition today in a fresh way. It is often said icons are but objects of prayer. Although true at face value, this kind of rhetorical trope in fact bears the seed of misunderstanding. Perhaps it can be seen as an oversimplification of the thought of the pioneers of the icon revival, who, in an attempt to deliver the icon from Western dominance, disparaged art since the Renaissance as distorted products of the imagination. Be that as it may, this kind of statement, as mentioned in the beginning, instead of safeguarding the icon, ends up undermining and stifling its creative import and fresh possibilities. It presupposes that since it is not the fine art of an ivory tower individualist, anyone can paint an icon. There is no need for previous artistic training, knowledge of pictorial principles, or imagination. But Is this not a denial of the icon as techne? In an attempt to liberate the icon, we end up shackling it by lowering the standards of its craftsmanship. The specter of fine art in the end wins, since we have not replaced it with an awareness and understanding of the traditional or normal doctrine of art. What we rather should be stressing is that the icon is, in fact, a clear example of the realization of the highest capacity of art. As we have said, demanding of us the highest level of knowledge and skill. This is one of the negative sides of today's rampant popularity of the icon. In an attempt to make it accessible to everyone, we unwittingly end up promulgating mediocrity, imitation, and mechanical copying, wherein the iconographer is expected to suppress his intellectual, creative, and interpretive engagement. The human component is undermined. With this attitude, it matters little whether the icon is hand-painted or mechanically reproduced by thousands. In the end, depersonalization replaces the presence of the author, or the author's experience or expression of his experience of the prototypes. Ironically, the icon, a witness to the unique personality. Oh, sorry, I wasn't intended. Let me get back there. The icon, ironically, a witness to the unique personality of the saints, those who have actualized their calling to deification in a particularized and unrepeatable manner, becomes a mechanistic exercise that stifles the unique mode of expression of the iconographer. But this, of course, is not to promulgate the modernist cult of individualism or so-called artistic genius. On the contrary, let us remember, life in Christ presupposes the flourishing of our true and unique personality, that is, conformity to our true nature or logos, as St. Maximus the Confessor would put it, in contradistinction to our egocentric or individualistic identity. Therefore, the traditional practice of not signing the icon should not be interpreted as an aspiration towards the complete obliteration of the iconographer's creative temperament. It is rather a reminder that only in humble cooperation with the divine craftsman, in becoming one with him, will his true self and art flourish to the fullness of their capacity. Thereby, he will be able to uncover nuances contained in the prototypes previously unnoticed and contribute unrepeatable expressions of tradition. In undermining this side of the icon, seeking to protect it from artistic license and foreign cultural influences, we may in fact blunt its power, making of it a purely mechanical act that contradicts basic principles of orthodoxy. How then is the iconographer to avoid the mistake of taking freedom for license? Only when he has made the tradition his lifeblood and experienced it from within, as ever-renewing power, as accessible today as it ever has been. Only when he has begun to discern and made the timeless pictorial principles of the icon his own. But how is he to avoid arbitrary innovation? Not by hesitation, but only by taking risks. Only when he has, as we have said, encountered the prototypes not as sketches observed external to himself, but as the heavenly realities or spiritual realities, saints he is communing with in the chamber of his heart, apprehending with his noetic eyes. Only when the logos, the dogmatic content which determine the composition of the subject, is known from the inside out, in such a way that it touches him, imprints him with its unique presence, and begins to guide the creative act. This is what we mean by interpreting and reimagining according to truth and ecclesiastic reality rather than fantasy. In other words, as Philip Davydov says in an essay called The Icon, if I'm not mistaken, which is part of his book called The Sacred in Life and Art, he says, in other words, there is here no distinction between art and contemplation. The artist must raise his vision from earthly to divine concerns and perceptions until he can mentally entertain the form which he is to imitate, until this form lives within him with its own inherent vitality. There has to be an endless renewal and repetition of the internal imaginative act, an endless recreation within the life of the artist of the spiritual realities which are the subject of his work, and which must spontaneously inform his work if it is to live. In such a process, although the iconographer will not seek self-expression for his own sake, his creative temperament will not be quenched, but rather given freedom in the Spirit. For where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is freedom. And as we have said, put in another way by the historian of medieval art, Ananda Kumaraswamy, quote, "This is inevitable, only because nothing can be known or done except in accordance with the mode of the knower. So the man himself, as he is in himself, appears in the style and handling, and can be recognized accordingly. Only when we paint from our experience and knowledge, arising from living communion with the subject depicted, rather than from the experience of others, whether they be from the 15th, 14th, or earlier centuries, will our icons be full of vitality and authenticity, living expressions of living tradition. Hence, expression will not be so much the vain exhibitionism of idiosyncrasies as the precise articulation of what needs to be said, arising from the subject of the work at hand. Keeping this in mind, let us also remember that no two homilies are identical in expression, although they proclaim the same truth. It is the same with the rich variety of expression seen in icon painting. The iconographer preaches the gospel in line and color. With his art he paints the word, plastically manifesting, indeed enfleshing the logos. This is truly an artistic license of charismatic expression in free will. Does not Christ ordain it so when he says, "Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature"? To conclude, let us summarize the basic principles of the iconographer's creative act, what we mean by freedom, imagination, and expression. The creative act is free insofar as it is directed by the purified and illumined nous which is imbued with tradition. Technique, skill, or art remains in the craftsman, as it is a science, a knowledge residing in him. With his art, he shapes and molds matter. This is the servile act. The free and servile functions coincide, the former consisting in the conception of some idea in an imitable form, the latter in the imitation of the invisible model in some material, which is thus informed. The object itself is not the art, it is rather the artifact. The one pertains to the nous and the other to manufacture. The intermediary between the two is the imaginative faculty, which should not be equated with mere fantasy. Rather, this faculty, guided by the nous, takes in sense impressions and combines them with images from the memory, arriving at pictorial solutions through a process of mental synthesis. Therefore, as Kumaraswamy says, echoing Cantiglu pertaining to traditional craftsmanship, quote, "The The artist's theoretical or imaginative act is said to be free because it is not assumed or admitted that he is blindly copying any model extrinsic to himself, but expressing himself even in adhering to a prescription or responding to requirements that may remain essentially the same for millennia. If these distinctions are kept in mind, there is no need to fear the imagination, expression, or so-called artistic license. In the homiletics of icon painting, we have been given the spirit of freedom, not of bondage. And as tradition himself says, behold, I make all things new. Before we wrap it up, that's it for in terms of, I'll show you some, what I'll show you next is some of the work that I've done, beginning with, with some of my first icons. I'm going the opposite way here. Hold on. Am I going the right way? There you go. Yeah. On the left-hand side is what I was working from the, what I was given to work from. It's a Golgotha image, crucifixion with the two figures of the Mother of God and St. John. And I was asked to basically redo the whole thing. The icons had been through a fire and they were cracking and falling apart, so I had to strip the wood and then repaint the images on them. And so on the right hand side there's sketches, preparatory drawings for the work. And it just basically goes to show that it's not a duplication of what was there before, but it's a thinking through the theme. And so this is the work itself on the right after it's done, and then detail on the left. This was an interesting project in that there aren't many icons of St. Martin of Tours in a Byzantine style, or what we would consider to be a traditional style of iconography, and so I found some Cretan icons and I wasn't pleased with the composition, and I was looking for some other references, and I eventually found a Gothic drawing from, I think it was from the 14th century, that was in the British Library, in a manuscript illustration of the life of St. Martin of Tours. And so I worked that drawing into the composition that you see here on the right hand side. And I turned it into a traditional work that is not so much something Western in ethos as something more, a combination of Byzantine and Russian styles. At the top there is a little detail of the life of St. Martin of Tours. The Lord appears to him, I think either in a dream or a vision, thanking him for covering him when he was naked. And that's what you see at the top, the Lord with the cloak that he's given to the poor man at the bottom. Which is basically, if you were to think of, you have to repeat exactly what you see in the prototype, and the work from previous centuries, then you don't have the leeway to then actually include details from the life of the saint that has not been painted previously. It completely cuts you off from the possibilities of actually elaborating a new composition that is in perfect harmony with the reality of the saint's life and contributes something very, very, very new and fresh to the tradition. This icon, this is another case of an icon that you don't see many icons of Venerable Bede in the Orthodox Church, although he's an Orthodox saint. So I was like, what am I going to do? I can't just come up with something out of the blue. I was thinking I gotta abide by some parameters that are like, I gotta rely on something that at least somebody hinted at And so I was looking around for manuscripts and how could he have looked like, and asking myself those questions. So then I relied on this prototype as a board to jump from, so to speak. And it is in a way very, very much reliant on that drawing, but at the same time with a completely different feeling after you're done with it. I didn't follow every single line necessarily, and the expressive quality of the two images are very different. And then I was asked to do 4 panels for an iconostas, and the challenge was that the panels were very narrow, and the person requesting, the person who was asking for the icon gave me prototypes to work from, but they were all different. I mean, they didn't have any specific continuity or theme visually, and so I had to then work from first this icon of the Mother of God of the White Lake, it's called, and that icon gave me the clues for the thematic, the themes that I would follow through in the other icons to tie them together. So I took from it like the blue border, and then the red halo became basically a component that tied the other 4 icons together. But as you can see, it also is a variation on the theme. The highlights of the garment are like a blue that gives it a shimmery kind of effect, whereas you don't have it on the original. And some of the proportions of the Lord are elaborated in a different way. Okay, this is the other one. This is the same iconostas, and this is one of the icons that I was given to work from. That's the other icon, so you're gonna crunch that. And this one was a challenge because Father Michael, who commissioned the work, he wanted Saint Innocent as a young priest. He didn't want him as a hierarch. And so I was like, how am I going to do that? I mean, I don't know how he looked when he was young. And so what I did is that I relied on a former prototype of, because the other thing is this, the other challenge is that you could have one saint who has, he looks different in all of his icons, so you're like, which one am I going to pick? If I'm going to be so strict about being traditional and relying on a prototype that makes my work legitimate, then I go crazy. So I have to somehow synthesize all that together into what would express Saint Innocent as a person. And so you have to be imaginative about it. And so here it's him preaching to the natives on the left hand side, and then he's writing the indication to the kingdom on the right hand side. In his life, we're told that he helped bring back to health an eagle he had found that was, I think, wounded or was almost dead. And the eagle became attached to him, and it wouldn't fly away, and eventually it flew away, but then it circled around and came down and prostrated to St. Innocent before it finally went away. But then I took it as a symbol of him healing the Americas through the preaching of the word. And to emphasize his apostolic mission, then on his picture kill, I put the apostles, Peter and Paul, and then at the bottom, St. Cyril and Methodius. Although you can't see one of the, I think it's either Cyril and Methodius, you can't make them out. But you get the idea, you fill in the blanks. And this one is, this goes to show how that kind of icon is completely different from the icon on the right hand side. Although I painted both icons, so depending on the challenge, the problem you have to solve, then it will almost define itself what the image will look like at the end. I was given this to work by. They wanted an icon of Holy Queen Tamara, the Georgian saint, and so that is an interpretation from that specific prototype.
When is that one from on the left?
That's a Georgian icon from Georgia, the Republic of Georgia.
Time?
Oh, the time is contemporary.
It's a contemporary.
Yeah. So, and this one you see outside, yeah. This one was also fun to paint because I wanted, I've always liked St. Onufrius, and I liked in particular the detail in his life where it says that he was given communion by an angel. And so I noticed that you didn't see that depicted. And so I said to myself, well, I want to depict that. You know, I mean, tradition allows me to do that. And so the challenge is, how are you going to depict it? And so I basically, from looking at different icons of St. Onufrius, there are many icons of St. Onufrius, I gathered the strongest points in those icons and created this composition. As you know, as you notice, the desert is blooming, right? It's beginning to sprout. It recalls the prophecy of Isaiah, the type that we read for the service of Theophany. The angel is peculiar because it's a seraph. It's a conflation of a seraph and a cherubim. It's many-eyed if you look at it closely. And while I was talking to Father Parthenius on our way down, we were reading the allegorical interpretation of St. Macarius the Great, the vision of Ezekiel. The way he describes the cherubim, it's many-eyed. And he describes he uses the cherubim as a symbol of the soul that has been that the Lord has enthroned himself onto, and how it becomes all luminous and all eyes and full with divine wisdom. And so to me it was a perfect image to use as a symbol of the having acquired or having lived up to the angelic life, which is what monasticism is. And also having attained to deification, because the seraphim and cherubim are the two closest of the angels in the divine hierarchies, as they're described by St. Dionysius the Areopagite. And also it calls to mind how paradise was guarded by a cherub, and so here St. Onufrius is re-entering paradise. He has attained to deification, the heights of deification, and that level of closeness to the Lord, becoming one with Him through His energies, only takes place in participation in the sacraments. So the Holy Eucharist was an essential part to his process of deification, although he was a hermit and he was completely cut off from civilization. And so the Lord provided an essential part of what he needed in his spiritual struggle through the angel. So to me, that the theme of the icon is very, very, very rich. And here is a typical example of how St. Onufrius would look like in a Cretan icon. And this is an icon that I'm working on right now. It's a sketch for St. Mama's icon. And that's, if you recall, I no longer spend hours trying to do a tonal study. As you saw when I was doing the drawing for the Golgotha, now I've gotten to the point where it's predominantly a linear drawing. I use a soft charcoal, vine charcoal, and that allows me to then rub it off fairly easily until I get to a clear conception of the image. And here some details are different. The character of the lion changes, although the general form is the same. It's not a goofy looking icon, it's a scary looking, goofy looking lion. It's a scary looking lion. And I was like, I wanted to make him look scary, because that's, in this life, people were like, actually, what are you doing riding a lion? And so some other details like the position of his arm, changes. And also his cape and so on and so forth. So that's all I have, Ben. So thank you.